Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries.
The city of Sydney, 1989. It was a time when the city was alive with new growth and energy. But for some, particularly those of a certain age, Sydney had become a quiet, reflective place. It was here, in the peaceful suburbs where elderly women lived out their twilight years in small, cozy homes, where the first whispers of terror began. Ivy Walker was well known in her neighborhood. At 82, she was still remarkably independent. Every morning, she would take her daily walk to the park, her frail body supported by a polished cane, her purse clutched tightly at her side. Her routine was unwavering. Leave the house at 9 a.m., a brisk walk around the block, a stop at the park bench to feed the birds, and then back home by 10. Neighbors often greeted her in passing, smiling as she moved steadily on her way, always dressed in her neatly pressed clothes. But this particular morning, something was different. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of something unseen. Ivy, always aware of her surroundings, noticed fewer people in the park today. The usual chatter of mothers with children or joggers on the path had quieted. She sat on her usual bench, the familiar creak of the wood beneath her offering a small comfort. From across the park, a man watched. John Wayne Glover had been walking this route for weeks now, studying the elderly women who frequented the area. He had noticed Ivy early on, her frailty, her routine. To Glover, she was perfect. Today, his plan would come to life. As Ivy sat feeding the birds, Glover approached slowly, his footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel path. His outward appearance was unremarkable. A man in his 50s, dressed in casual slacks and a button-down shirt. His thinning hair was combed neatly, and his face, though lined with age, held a pleasant, approachable smile. "Good morning, ma'am," Glover said as he neared Ivy, keeping his voice light, his tone disarming. Ivy looked up, squinting slightly in the bright morning sun. She returned the smile, her wrinkled face softening. "Good morning," she replied, her voice thin but warm. Glover sat down beside her on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. He struck up a conversation, asking about the birds, the weather, and if she lived nearby. Ivy, always polite, answered his questions, though a growing unease began to creep over her. Something about the man felt off, though she couldn't quite place it. As they talked, Glover's eyes remained focused on her. His thoughts were dark, his heart pounding in his chest, as he fought to suppress the urge that had been building inside him for weeks. Every moment he spent in Ivy's presence, the more difficult it became to control the violent impulse lurking just beneath the surface. Suddenly, Ivy stood, gripping her cane tightly. "Well, I should be getting home now," she said with a slight tremor in her voice. "It was nice talking to you." Glover stood as well, offering a friendly nod. "Of course you take care now," he said, watching her as she walked away, her pace slow and unsteady. For a brief moment, Glover hesitated. He could still walk away, return to his normal life, leave Ivy to her peaceful routine. But the pull was too strong. His hands twitched at his sides, and before he realized it, his feet were moving, following her. Ivy's house was just around the corner from the park, a small, modest bungalow nestled between two larger homes. She didn't notice Glover behind her as she made her way down the quiet street, her mind focused on getting home, where she would feel safe again. As she reached the front gate of her yard, she fumbled with her keys, her hand shaking slightly. That's when she heard it, a faint rustling behind her. She turned, her eyes widening in shock as Glover lunged at her, his hands outstretched. The first blow came quickly, the hammer in his hand striking the back of her head with a sickening thud. Ivy crumpled to the ground, her cane clattering to the sidewalk. Glover's breathing was ragged, his heart racing as he stood over her motionless body. He knelt beside her, his hand shaking as he reached for her purse. The zipper slid open with ease, but the contents, coins, a few bills, a lipstick, held no meaning for him. It wasn't the money he wanted. He looked down at Ivy, her frail body lying so still on the ground, and for a moment, he felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse. Only a hollow emptiness that echoed inside him, even as he wiped the blood from his hands onto his trousers. By the time the police arrived, Ivy's body had been discovered by a neighbor who had seen her lying on the sidewalk. The street was soon cordoned off, yellow tape stretching across the quiet neighborhood as officers and detectives combed the area for clues. But there were none. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no clear motive. The community was in shock. Ivy Walker, the sweet old lady everyone knew, had been brutally murdered in broad daylight. The news spread quickly, and soon, fear settled over the elderly women of Sydney. They began locking their doors, avoiding their usual walks, and looking over their shoulders whenever they stepped outside. But for Glover, life went on as usual. He returned home that evening, greeted his wife with a smile, and sat down to dinner as if nothing had happened. He watched the news later that night, the report of Ivy's murder playing on the screen in front of him. His wife sitting beside him, gasped in horror, her hand flying to her mouth. "How awful," she whispered. "Who would do such a thing?" Glover didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the day in his head. The hammer, the blood, the feeling of power that surged through him as he stood over Ivy's lifeless body. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, a feeling he knew he would want again. As the days passed after Ivy Walker's murder, a heavy sense of dread began to settle over Sydney's elderly population. In the suburbs, where quiet mornings once brought comfort, fear now stalked the streets. The police had no solid leads, only a vague suspicion that Ivy's killer was someone familiar with the area. The randomness of the crime, the brutality of the attack, and the lack of a clear motive left both law enforcement and the public grasping for answers. Women who had once felt safe enough to walk alone now stayed behind locked doors. The chatter at local grocery stores and church gatherings turned to hushed whispers about who might be next. But amidst this fear, there was one person who moved through the streets undetected, blending in seamlessly with the rest of the community: John Wayne Glover. He listened to the rumors with a quiet satisfaction, his heart racing whenever he overheard conversations about the unknown attacker. People speculated it could be a young thug, a random criminal, or even a transient. No one suspected Glover, the mild-mannered husband and father, known for his charming smile and calm demeanor. In the weeks following Ivy's murder, Glover resumed his normal routine. His job at a charity for the elderly provided him with the perfect cover. His days were spent visiting nursing homes, assisting elderly women with various tasks, and gaining their trust. He was patient. He knew there would be another opportunity soon. 3 months after Ivy's murder, Glover's thirst for control became too strong to ignore. He had chosen his next target carefully, an 82-year-old widow named Dorothy Turner. Dorothy lived alone in a small house not far from the park where Ivy had been attacked. She was a quiet woman who rarely left her home except for a weekly trip to the grocery store and occasional visits to the nearby church. Glover had seen her on several occasions, observing her slow, deliberate movements, noting how she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her frail shoulders. To him, Dorothy was just another mark, another helpless victim who would never see it coming. On a cool evening in early spring, Glover made his move. He waited outside Dorothy's home, lurking in the shadows until she appeared. As she fumbled with her keys at the front door, he approached silently, his footsteps blending into the night. This time, he carried a length of pantyhose in his pocket, twisted tightly into a garrote. Before Dorothy could react, Glover was upon her. His hands wrapped the pantyhose around her neck, pulling it tight as she gasped for air. Dorothy's hands flailed in desperation, clawing at the garrote, but her strength was no match for Glover's brute force. The struggle lasted only moments, and soon, Dorothy's body went limp, her breath escaping in a final, ragged exhale. Glover stood over her for a moment, his chest heaving as he stared down at her lifeless form. The rush was overwhelming, the power, the control. It was the same feeling he had experienced with Ivy, but now it was more intense, more exhilarating. He had perfected his method, and with each attack, his confidence grew. The discovery of Dorothy Turner's body ignited a firestorm of media attention. The local news ran headline after headline, warning the elderly to be vigilant, to stay indoors, to trust no one. The idea that a predator was targeting the most vulnerable members of society struck a deep chord with the public. The streets became quieter, and Sydney's elderly citizens were gripped by a fear they hadn't known before. The police, under increasing pressure to solve the case, launched a full-scale investigation. They scoured the neighborhood, questioning anyone who had seen or heard something unusual on the night of Dorothy's murder. But like Ivy's case, there were no witnesses, no clear leads. The only connection between the two murders was the victim's age and vulnerability. Whoever the killer was, he was careful, methodical, and left behind no trace. Glover, meanwhile, watched the media coverage with a detached interest. He knew the attention would make his next move more difficult, but the challenge excited him. He liked the idea of outsmarting the police, of slipping through their fingers while they chased shadows. He began to read every article, every news report, dissecting the language used to describe him. A faceless monster, a predator in the dark. But despite the growing fear, Glover maintained his mask of normalcy. At home, he was the same loving husband and father, attentive and caring. His wife had no reason to suspect anything unusual, and neither did his colleagues at the charity. In fact, his work with the elderly made him appear even more trustworthy, a man who cared deeply for those in need. As Glover plotted his next attack, the police were quietly closing in. They had begun to notice a pattern, a geographic connection between the victims and certain areas frequented by elderly women. While they had no solid suspects, they knew the killer was likely someone familiar with the elderly community. Detectives interviewed staff at local charities, nursing homes, and senior centers, hoping to find a lead. One afternoon, Glover was at a local nursing home, chatting with the staff about an upcoming charity event. The conversation was light, casual, until one of the nurses mentioned the recent murders. She spoke about how terrifying it must be for the elderly women in the neighborhood, and how she hoped the police would catch the killer soon. Glover smiled politely, nodding in agreement, but his mind was racing. He knew the police were searching for him, and it was only a matter of time before they connected the dots. For the first time, he felt a flicker of fear, but that fear quickly turned to anger, a deep, simmering rage that would soon find its outlet in another brutal attack. By mid-1990, the city of Sydney was gripped by paranoia. The killer had struck twice, and the police were no closer to catching him. Elderly women in the community were taking every precaution, but for Glover, this only made the hunt more thrilling. He had already chosen his next victim, an 84-year-old woman named Gladys Roberts. Gladys lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, a quiet place where few people ventured. She was a regular at the local church, where she volunteered every Sunday, helping with the charity events that Glover also attended. He had noticed her weeks before, her delicate frame and gentle demeanor making her an easy target. But this time, Glover wanted something different. He wanted to toy with his victim, to draw out the fear and anticipation before the final moment. One Sunday afternoon, Glover followed Gladys home from church. He watched her from a distance, noting how she moved slowly, her steps careful and measured. When she reached her apartment building, he followed her inside, slipping through the door just as it closed behind her. Gladys didn't notice him at first. She was focused on unlocking her door, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the key. But when she turned, she saw him, standing in the hallway, his eyes fixed on her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wavering. Glover smiled, taking a step closer. "I'm sorry. I think I have the wrong apartment," he said, his tone polite but cold. Gladys nodded, turning back to her door. But before she could open it, Glover was upon her. He shoved her inside, slamming the door behind them. Gladys screamed, but no one heard her. The building was old, the walls thick, and the neighbors rarely paid attention to the sounds around them. The struggle was brief. Glover overpowered her easily, using his bare hands this time, relishing the sensation of her life slipping away beneath his fingers. When it was over, he stood in the silence of the apartment, his breath heavy, his hands trembling with adrenaline. As the police investigated Gladys' murder, they began to notice a disturbing pattern. The locations of the attacks, the types of victims, all pointed to someone who had intimate knowledge of the elderly community. They expanded their investigation, interviewing staff at local charities, including Glover's. For the first time, Glover felt the pressure. He knew he was being watched, and he began to grow paranoid. Every glance, every conversation seemed suspicious. But instead of stopping, he doubled down, determined to outsmart the police and continue his reign of terror. By mid-1990, John Wayne Glover was both feared and unseen. The media had branded him the Granny Killer, and the entire city of Sydney was in the grip of fear. Elderly women who had once filled the parks and local shops now stayed indoors, too terrified to venture out alone. Family members checked in on their aging relatives more frequently, and the police presence in neighborhoods surged. Despite the precautions, no one felt safe. For Glover, this atmosphere of fear was intoxicating. Every news broadcast, Every whispered conversation about the unknown killer fueled his sense of power. Yet, beneath this calm exterior, a storm was brewing. His need to control, his desire to kill, was becoming more erratic, harder to manage. The carefully calculated predator was starting to unravel, and the line between his normal life and his life as a killer was becoming dangerously blurred. Glover's wife, Gay, noticed subtle changes in her husband. His mood shifted unpredictably. At times he was distant, lost in his own thoughts, and at other moments he was unusually affectionate. But Gay chalked it up to the stress of his work with the elderly, never imagining the monstrous truth that lay just beneath the surface. The police investigation was gaining momentum. Detectives had begun to connect the dots between the victims and the locations they frequented. All of the women had ties to the same charity network, which was heavily involved with elderly care programs in the area. They conducted background checks on the volunteers and workers, quietly gathering information. Though Glover was careful to maintain his composed facade, he couldn't ignore the growing presence of the police. On more than one occasion, he had spotted plainclothes officers lingering near the charity offices or asking questions at the nursing homes where he worked. The sensation of being watched sent his paranoia into overdrive. He knew he had to be more cautious, but his compulsion to kill was stronger than ever. It was in this heightened state of tension that Glover made his first critical mistake. One afternoon, while visiting a nursing home under the guise of his charitable work, Glover struck up a conversation with an elderly woman named Margaret Connors. She was 87, frail and soft-spoken, and lived alone in a nearby apartment. Glover sensed vulnerability in her right away, and within minutes, he had offered to help her carry some groceries back to her home. She agreed, trusting this seemingly kind and helpful man. But once inside her apartment, the mood shifted. Glover's facade of friendliness melted away, replaced by a cold, predatory stare. Margaret noticed the change too late. As she turned to thank him for his help, Glover was already moving towards her, a length of pantyhose twisted in his hands. This time, the attack didn't go as smoothly. Margaret fought back, harder than he had expected. She screamed, kicking and clawing at Glover's face. Her resistance caught him off guard, and in his panic, he miscalculated. The neighbors heard the commotion and immediately called the police. Glover, breathing heavily and bloody from Margaret's nails, fled the scene just before the authorities arrived. Margaret survived the attack, but she was too shaken to provide a coherent description of her attacker. However, this failed attempt marked the beginning of Glover's downfall. He had left behind evidence this time: scratches on his face, fingerprints on the door, and most damningly, a witness who had seen his face, however briefly. The police, now working with a partial description from Margaret, started to narrow their focus. They revisited their list of potential suspects, honing in on those with access to elderly women in the area. John Wayne Glover's name came up more than once. As a regular volunteer for the charity, he had close contact with numerous elderly women, and his calm demeanor seemed almost too perfect. Glover, sensing that the walls were closing in, began to unravel further. He was more paranoid, more erratic, often snapping at his wife and colleagues over minor issues. He stopped sleeping, plagued by nightmares of being caught, and yet the urge to kill persisted. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, and Glover was walking a razor's edge. Detective Senior Sergeant Joe Matthews had been leading the investigation for months, and he knew they were getting closer. He had seen killers like Glover before, men who thrived on the terror they created. who slipped through the cracks by hiding in plain sight. But Matthews also knew that every killer made mistakes, and Glover's time was running out. Despite the growing heat from the police investigation, Glover couldn't resist the pull of his compulsion. He knew it was risky, possibly even reckless, but the need to exert his control over another victim was overwhelming. His next target was Joan Sinclair, a 60-year-old woman who lived alone in a quiet neighborhood. Joan was different from his previous victims in one important way. She was younger, still relatively mobile, and more independent. But to Glover, she represented the same vulnerability. He saw her as another lonely woman, someone he could overpower and control. Glover had met Joan several times through his charity work, and she had grown to trust him. On the afternoon of May 19, 1990, Glover visited her home under the pretense of discussing some charity business. Joan welcomed him in, offering tea and chatting about mundane things. To her, he was just a friendly face, someone who had always been kind and attentive. But Glover had no intention of leaving Joan's house that day without claiming her life. As she turned her back to pour tea, Glover seized the opportunity. This time, there were no mistakes. He attacked swiftly, wrapping the pantyhose around her neck with brutal precision. Joan struggled, but Glover's grip was unrelenting. The struggle was brief, and when it was over, Glover calmly arranged her body on the floor, making sure to leave as little evidence as possible. But something about this murder felt different to Glover. It wasn't just the thrill anymore. There was something darker, something more sinister brewing inside him. He lingered in Joan's house for a moment longer than usual, staring down at her lifeless body, trying to make sense of the feelings that swirled within him. The murder of Joan Sinclair sent shockwaves through Sydney. The police, already on high alert, knew they were dealing with a seasoned predator, someone who was becoming bolder and more dangerous with each attack. But they were closing in. Detective Matthews and his team ramped up their efforts, revisiting every clue, every scrap of evidence they had collected. They analyzed the pattern of the killings, noting the similarities in the method of attack and the locations. And with each new piece of information, the net around Glover grew tighter. What Glover didn't realize was that the police were now watching him. They had connected the dots between his movements and the locations of the murders. His erratic behavior, once dismissed as stress from his work, was now seen in a different light. They began tailing him, quietly observing his every move, waiting for him to slip up. And slip up he did. One evening, as Glover returned home, an officer noticed something odd. Glover's hands were trembling, and there was a dark stain on his shirt, something that looked suspiciously like blood. The officer reported it to Detective Matthews, and it was all the confirmation they needed. On March 19, 1990, the police made their move. They obtained a warrant to search Glover's home, and what they found was damning. Hidden in his garage were several items that linked him directly to the murderers: pantyhose, hammers, and a collection of personal items that had belonged to his victims. Glover was arrested that same day. As the police led him away in handcuffs, his neighbors watched in stunned silence. To them, John Wayne Glover had always been a kind, gentle man. The idea that he could be responsible for such horrific crimes was unimaginable. But Glover showed no remorse. During his interrogation, he remained calm and collected, refusing to give any details about the murders. He offered no explanation for his actions, no apology to the families of his victims. To him, it was as though the murders had been nothing more than a grim necessity, something he had to do. The trial of John Wayne Glover was one of the most highly publicized in Australia's history. The media dubbed him the Granny Killer, and every detail of the case was dissected in the press. Families of the victims attended the trial, seeking justice for their loved ones, while the public watched in morbid fascination. Psychologists testified that Glover suffered from a severe personality disorder, though they argued that he was fully aware of his actions. His calm demeanor throughout the trial only fueled the public's outrage. How could someone commit such heinous acts and feel nothing? Glover was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, the terror he had caused lingered in the minds of Sydney's elderly residents. For them, the scars of his crimes would never fully heal. With Glover behind bars, the city of Sydney slowly began to recover. Parks filled up again, elderly women ventured out more freely, and the overwhelming sense of fear began to dissipate. But for the families of Glover's victims, the wounds remained fresh. They would never forget the loved ones they had lost or the horrifying way in which they were taken. Glover, meanwhile, adjusted to life in prison. He became something of a celebrity among the other inmates, feared and respected for the crimes he had committed. But inside, Glover was still the same man, controlled by the same dark impulses that had driven him to kill. He remained a silent, calculating presence, always watching, always waiting. And though he would never walk free again, the shadow of John Wayne Glover, the Granny Killer, would continue to loom large over Sydney for years to come. John Wayne Glover's world had shrunk to a cold, gray prison cell. The freedom he once relished, the freedom to walk unnoticed among his victims, to carry out his deadly impulses, was gone. Now, the only things he could control were the fleeting thoughts that raced through his mind. It had been months since his conviction, and while the world outside moved on, inside, Glover remained unchanged. The guards barely spoke to him, their expressions cold and devoid of the curiosity he had grown used to during the trial. He was an inmate now, a number in the system, stripped of the media's attention. But deep down, Glover still craved that power, that feeling of control. In the dim light of his cell, Glover's thoughts often drifted back to his victims. He didn't feel guilt. He never had. But there was something about their faces, their vulnerability, that occupied his mind. Each one had been a piece of his twisted puzzle, and now those pieces lay scattered in his memory, unreachable. For the families of Glover's victims, life would never return to normal. The pain of losing a loved one was deepened by the horrific nature of the crimes, and many struggled with anger and frustration, knowing that Glover had never shown remorse. Mary Patterson, the daughter of one of Glover's victims, had spent the months since the trial in a fog of grief. Her mother, June Patterson, had been a kind woman, always willing to help others, and now she was gone, taken by a man who had shown her nothing but cruelty. Mary attended every therapy session offered to her, but the nightmares persisted. She often dreamed of her mother, hearing her voice, only to wake up to the cold reality of her absence. The media had done little to help. Every article, every news story about Glover reopened old wounds. Even after the trial, reporters hounded the families for statements, asking them if they felt any satisfaction now that Glover was behind bars. But satisfaction was not what Mary felt. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness, a void that no sentence could ever fill. In prison, Glover underwent multiple psychological evaluations. The authorities hoped to understand what drove a man like him to commit such heinous crimes. The interviews were methodical, conducted by seasoned psychologists, who had seen their share of violent offenders. But Glover was different. He spoke calmly, never raising his voice, never showing emotion. When asked about the murders, he described them in clinical terms, as though he were recounting someone else's actions. There was no remorse, no regret, only a chilling indifference. Dr. Evelyn Hartley, one of the leading psychologists on the case, had spent years studying criminal minds, but Glover's demeanor unnerved even her. His lack of empathy was expected, but it was the precision with which he described the murders that left her unsettled. He talked about the elderly women as if they were objects, pieces in a game he had been playing for years. But what struck Dr. Hartley the most was Glover's need for control. He had never been impulsive in his actions. Every murder had been planned, every detail meticulously thought out. It was as if the act of killing gave him a sense of power that he couldn't find anywhere else in his life. The women were helpless, and that's what made them his perfect targets. As the sessions continued, Dr. Hartley began to notice something else. Glover was starting to slip. There were moments when his calm exterior faltered, when his voice would waver ever so slightly. It was as though the mask he had worn for so long was beginning to crack, and behind it, the real Glover was hiding. In prison, Glover quickly learned the unspoken rules of survival. Despite his notoriety, he kept a low profile, avoiding the more violent inmates and spending most of his time alone. He knew that many of the prisoners had heard of him, but in the world behind bars, his crimes didn't hold the same weight they did on the outside. He wasn't a gang leader or a drug kingpin. He was an old man who had preyed on defenseless women. The prison guards watched him closely. Glover never caused trouble, never raised his voice or challenged their authority, but there was something about him that kept them on edge. His silence was unnerving, and the way he observed those around him, calmly, without judgment, made them uneasy. One guard, Officer Thomas Hale, had worked in the prison system for over a decade, and he prided himself on being able to read inmates. But Glover was an enigma. He would sit for hours in his cell, staring at the walls, never asking for anything, never showing any sign of distress. It was as if the man was waiting for something no one else could see. Hale couldn't shake the feeling that Glover was still playing his game, even from inside his cell. And though the prison walls kept him confined, Glover's influence, his presence, still lingered, like a dark cloud over the facility. Outside the prison walls, the elderly community in Sydney remained deeply shaken by Glover's crimes. Though he had been caught and sentenced, the fear he had instilled lingered. Senior citizens, once comfortable in their routines, found themselves looking over their shoulders, distrustful of even the smallest kindnesses. Community groups organized self-defense classes for the elderly, and local authorities increased patrols in neighborhoods with higher populations of senior citizens. But no amount of security could erase the memories of Glover's reign of terror. In a small support group for the elderly, women who had lived through the terror shared their fears and anxieties. Many had known Glover, if only in passing, and the realization that such evil could exist in someone so seemingly kind and gentle was almost too much to bear. One woman, Doris Clark, spoke softly as she recounted the day she had met Glover at a local charity event. He had helped her with her groceries, smiling and chatting politely. It was only later, after his arrest, that she realized how close she had come to becoming one of his victims. The thought haunted her, and though she tried to go about her life as she had before, there was always a shadow of doubt, a lingering fear that someone else, someone just like Glover could be out there. As the months turned into years, Glover's health began to deteriorate. He had always been a heavy drinker and smoker, and the years of abuse had taken their toll. His once sharp mind was starting to dull, and his body, once strong enough to overpower his victims, was weakening. In the prison infirmary, Glover was a frequent visitor. The nurses who cared for him found it difficult to reconcile the frail old man before them with the cold-blooded killer they had read about in the papers. But even in his weakened state, Glover retained an air of control. He never complained, never asked for more than what was necessary. It was as though he had accepted his fate, content to live out the rest of his days in silence. But for those who knew him, there was a sense that Glover was still holding something back. He had never confessed to all of his crimes, never fully explained the depths of his depravity. And as his health declined, there was a growing fear that he would take his secrets to the grave. In the end, it wasn't the prison walls or the justice system that claimed John Wayne Glover. It was time. After nearly 2 decades behind bars, Glover's body finally gave out. He died quietly in his sleep, his death barely making the news. For many, his passing brought a sense of closure. The monster who had terrorized their community was gone, and with him, the lingering fear that had haunted Sydney for so long. But for others, Glover's death felt incomplete. There were still questions that had never been answered, still victims whose stories had never been told. The prison held a small, unceremonious service for Glover. No family members attended, and only a handful of guards stood by as his body was laid to rest. There was no marker for his grave, no memorial for the man who had caused so much pain. In death, as in life, John Wayne Glover remained an enigma, silent, calculating, and utterly devoid of remorse. In the years following Glover's death, the memory of his crimes began to fade, but the impact he had on the city of Sydney was permanent. His victims' families, though relieved that he was gone, continued to live with the scars of their loss. Support groups formed, and counseling services were offered to those still struggling with the trauma. But beyond the individual grief, Glover had left behind something more insidious, a legacy of fear. The elderly community, once vibrant and active, had been changed by his actions. Many older women, even those who had never been directly affected by his crimes, spoke of a lingering sense of vulnerability, a fear that someone else could be lurking in the shadows. Local authorities, in response to Glover's crimes, implemented new safety measures for senior citizens. Neighborhood watch programs became more prevalent, and self-defense classes for the elderly were widely promoted. But no amount of security could completely erase the fear that had taken hold. For the people of Sydney, John Wayne Glover was more than just a killer. He was a reminder of the darkness that could exist in the most ordinary of places. And though he was gone, his shadow would continue to loom over the city, a silent reminder of the terror he had once unleashed. With Glover's death came a renewed interest in the unsolved murders that had plagued Sydney in the years before his capture. While the authorities were confident that Glover was responsible for the 6 murders he had been convicted of, there were whispers of other victims, women whose disappearances and deaths had never been connected to the Granny Killer. Detective Rachel Murphy, a seasoned investigator who had worked on the Glover case in its early days, had always suspected that Glover's victim count was higher. In the wake of his death, she revisited the old case files, poring over missing persons reports and unsolved homicides that bore similarities to Glover's known modus operandi. There were at least 3 other elderly women who had been found strangled, their bodies left in public places, just like Glover's victims. But without a confession or concrete evidence, these cases had remained cold. Now, with Glover gone, the chances of ever solving them seemed slim. Still, Murphy couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. She reached out to the families of the unsolved cases, hoping to find new leads, but most had long since given up hope of finding answers. For Murphy, the unresolved cases became an obsession. She spent long nights in the precinct, piecing together timelines, trying to find connections that had been missed. But each lead seemed to end in frustration, a dead end that left her feeling as though Glover had won, even from beyond the grave. Time had passed since Glover's death, but for the families of his victims, the wounds were still fresh. Mary Patterson, whose mother had been one of Glover's last victims, had struggled for years to move on. Therapy had helped, but there were still nights when the weight of her grief felt unbearable. Mary had become active in the victims' rights movement, speaking at events and advocating for better support for those affected by violent crime. She had found a sense of purpose in her activism, but there was still an emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. The loss of her mother had left a void that time could not heal. One night, after a particularly emotional speech at a victim support group, Mary found herself sitting alone in her car, staring at the darkened streets of Sydney. The city had changed since her mother's death. New buildings had gone up, old neighborhoods had been revitalized, but to Mary, it still felt like the same place. The same place where her mother had been taken from her. She lit a cigarette, the smoke curling through the air as she thought about Glover. His death had brought some closure, but it hadn't been enough. There were still questions, still things she wished she could ask him. Why her mother? Why any of them? The answers, she knew, would never come. Even years after Glover's death, the elderly community in Sydney remained on edge. For many, the fear that Glover had instilled never fully faded. Women who had been his target demographic, those in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, were still haunted by the knowledge that someone like him had walked among them for so long, unnoticed. At a local senior center, where many of Glover's victims had once spent their days, the mood was somber. Though the staff tried to keep spirits high with activities and social events, there was always an undercurrent of fear. Every time a new staff member was hired, there were murmurs of distrust. Was this person really who they claimed to be? Could another predator be hiding in plain sight? Margaret Hughes, one of the center's oldest members, had been a friend of Glover's first victim. She had been the one to find her body that fateful morning, and the memory still haunted her. Every time she walked through the hallways of the center, she could see it in her mind, the way her friend's lifeless body had been left, discarded like she was nothing. Margaret had lived through 2 decades of grief, but the scars were still fresh. She had become more reclusive over the years, avoiding public places and limiting her interactions with strangers. Her once vibrant social life had withered, and now she spent most of her days alone in her small apartment, the TV flickering in the background as she tried to keep the bad memories at bay. In a twist of fate, Glover's journal was discovered years after his death. The old, weathered notebook had been hidden among his personal belongings, long forgotten in the clutter of the prison storage room. Its pages were filled with cryptic notes, sketches, and what appeared to be confessions for crimes the authorities hadn't linked to him. Detective Murphy was the first to examine the journal. As she flipped through the pages, she realized that Glover had been keeping a detailed record of his thoughts during the years leading up to his arrest. But what disturbed her the most were the entries that suggested he had committed other murders, ones that had never been connected to him. There were vague descriptions of women, dates, and locations, but no names. Murphy cross-referenced the dates with the cold case files she had been studying, and to her horror, many of them matched unsolved murders in the Sydney area. The journal seemed to confirm what she had long suspected. Glover had killed more than anyone had realized. But there was one entry that stood out, one that chilled her to the bone. In it, Glover described a woman he had met shortly before his arrest, someone he had been watching for weeks. The entry ended abruptly, with no mention of what had happened to her. Had she been another potential victim? Or had Glover been caught before he could strike again? Murphy knew that the journal could hold the key to solving the cold cases, but without more concrete evidence, it would be difficult to prove. Still, the discovery reignited her determination. She vowed to continue her investigation, no matter how long it took. As the years passed, public interest in Glover's case ebbed and flowed. True crime documentaries and podcasts kept his story alive, dissecting every detail of his crimes and speculating about the possibility of more victims. There was a morbid fascination with Glover, a need to understand what had driven a seemingly ordinary man to commit such extraordinary evil. The media often painted Glover as a monster, a figure of pure darkness. But for those who had known him in life, the reality was more complex. Glover had been a husband, a father, a neighbor. He had lived among them, hidden in plain sight, his true nature obscured by the facade of normalcy. One particularly popular podcast, The Granny Killer Files, gained a large following by exploring the psychological aspects of Glover's crimes. Hosted by criminal psychologist Dr. Louise Carter, the show delved into Glover's background, examining his childhood, his relationships, and the events that had shaped him into the man who would later become one of Australia's most notorious serial killers. Listeners were captivated by the chilling details of Glover's life, but there was always a sense of unease that accompanied the story. How many more men like Glover were out there, waiting to be discovered? And how many victims, like the women Glover had targeted, would never see justice? In the end, John Wayne Glover was buried in an unmarked grave, his final resting place unknown to the public. There was no headstone, no memorial to mark his existence. His name, once notorious, had faded from the headlines, replaced by the next wave of shocking crimes. But for those whose lives he had touched, his victims, their families, the detectives who had hunted him, Glover's presence remained. He was a ghost that lingered in the shadows, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk in even the most ordinary of men. As Detective Murphy stood by the gravesite, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unfinished business. Glover had taken his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only fragments of the truth. The journal had offered some answers, but there were still so many questions that would never be resolved. Murphy placed a single flower on the unmarked grave and turned to leave. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that Glover's story wasn't truly over. The victims he had claimed would never be forgotten, and the shadow he had cast over Sydney would linger for years to come. For the city of Sydney, John Wayne Glover's reign of terror had been a dark chapter in its history. But as the years passed, the city had begun to heal. New generations grew up unaware of the fear that had once gripped the streets, and the memory of Glover's crime slowly faded into the annals of true crime lore. Yet, for those who had lived through it, the families of the victims, the police who had worked the case, the elderly women who had lived in fear, Glover's shadow would always remain. He had been an ordinary man, with an extraordinary capacity for evil, and his legacy would be one of darkness, a reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of human nature. As the sun set on the city, casting long shadows over the streets, there was a sense of closure. But there was also a lingering unease, a knowledge that evil could arise again in the most unexpected places. And so, the story of John Wayne Glover came to an end, but the scars he left behind would endure.